Good morning, and may I formally welcome Dr. Nick Westcott, who is Director at the Royal African Society. And may I thank you very much in advance for contributing your expertise to us today. May I also take the opportunity, as ever at this point, to give a reminder to all of us that this session will be televised, it's on the record, so that we could take care of that, have a mind for that, but also that when we ask questions as members of the committee, if there is an interest we need to declare, we should do so on the first occasion on which we ask a question. As ever, I'm going to ask the first question, and then I shall turn to my colleagues to follow up with some more detailed points of view. Mine is a more broad and opening one. So, Dr. Westcott, the government announced that it was going to have an Africa strategy, a new strategy. Some of us have found it difficult to discern exactly what that is. When you've examined it, what do you consider to be the priorities of the UK government in its relations with Africa, and do you think they're the right ones? Over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to come and talk to you. Some I know from before, some former bosses. Very nice to be here. And I should immediately myself declare an interest. I was slightly involved in drawing up what the government regards, I understand, as a strategic approach rather than a strategy to Africa. So I know a bit from the inside. I'm sure no more than the government will tell you itself. But it means I was both involved and have some opinions, as not all my views were reflected. The government's priorities were sort of discussed by the NSC, when was it, in 2018, I think, after a considerable preparatory period during 2017 and early 2018. And they identified the 5 shifts that I think have been publicly announced, which is to prioritise inclusive and sustainable growth, security and stability, particularly counter-terrorism, family planning and women's education, climate change mitigation, and an increased geographical focus on the Sahel, and combine all that with expanding the UK's footprint in Africa by opening new posts. In her speech to the South African Parliament in Cape Town in August 2018, following this, which is, if you like, the fullest public expression of this strategy, as it has never been published as a strategy, Theresa May added an increased focus on UK investment in Africa, the ambition to become the largest G7 investor, and announcement of significant additional resources for CDC. Secondly, that the British approach should focus on trying to manage migration flows. And thirdly, there should be a focus on anti-corruption. So that's, if you like, that is the broad area where the government seems to be trying to prioritise its attachment. I think it has somewhat been lost in translation. It has not ever been clearly expressed. And it would be good for the government to make a slightly clearer and public strategy, because there's not much value in a strategy unless it is public, in my view. That's part of the whole point, that people can see where you're going. Obviously, it's a question of how you allocate your effort and your resources. But there is no point having one set inside and a different set for the public. The current Prime Minister, gave a fairly general outline of Britain's aspirations in relation to Africa in his speech to the African Investment Conference 2 weeks ago. But that didn't really add anything new, other than that we wanted to do business with Africa, which was an integral part of those strategic shifts. I don't know whether you would like me to continue with my own view of what the strategic
We would welcome
should be.
your view of where the priorities should indeed lie.
I think looking back a bit, and I've spent a lot of time talking to African leaders, academics, media people, businessmen, all the rest. But the overall perception of the UK is that it has been a major player and a major partner for Africa, but that it is fading. I wouldn't say declining, I would say fading in people's awareness, partly overshadowed by other international partners who have come in a big way, and partly demonstrating less visible engagement with the continent. And this was particularly in the last 10 years. And therefore, I think it's an important strategic objective to make visible that Britain wants to engage more closely by listening and visiting. So that would be number one objective, to demonstrate visibly and physically that we are re-engaging with Africa, because the Africans themselves feel that engagement has been waning. Secondly, I think it's right that within that dialogue we should be having with Africa, top priority is sustainable growth with a particular focus on creating jobs. And we do this through the trade agreements that we will have, through the investment, as Theresa May advertised, but a lot more we could do to encourage African governments, or to support African governments in encouraging entrepreneurship. Because most of this growth, particularly in the informal sector, and particularly job-creating growth, is going to come in the small, informal sector from African entrepreneurs themselves. And there are currently many obstacles faced by Africans who are enterprising people who want to develop their own business, grow their economies, expand their jobs. And that could be hugely supportive. We as the UK have quite a lot of experience, expertise, funding available, but it needs to be directed to that objective. Third priority, I would say, is to encourage transparency and accountability in government. And I would phrase it thus, because one of the things that my African interlocutors appear to value most about the UK is its values, its experience of democracy, which has been very respected. And there's a lot of affection amongst Commonwealth countries for this country and its strong traditions of free press, free speech, democratic institutions, and visible and effective accountability. They like that about us. And therefore, they look to us to support that in their own countries. When I say they, I'm often talking about the public and the civil society rather necessarily than governments. But you yourselves have close links with a lot of African parliamentarians, and those are immensely valuable in teaching the techniques, the mechanics, the habits of democracy and how to ensure accountability. I prefer the word accountability to democracy because each society has to find its own way towards a solution. There's no sort of pre-packed, this is democracy, this is the way you do it. We know that. But there has to be effective accountability, and it can come in a lot of different ways. And that is the way to tackle problems like corruption. If you just focus on anti-corruption, you can spend a lot of money to not much effect. But building those institutions and those traditions. And secondly, it requires an international effort. So not just the UK, we need to do this in partnership with other members of the international community, not all of whom are pointing in the same direction. Most of our European partners are. The US traditionally has been, perhaps a little less at the moment. The Russians are definitely not. The Chinese are sort of, in some ways not, but have a different set of priorities which sometimes overlap with ours. But we might come on to the international aspect anyway. Fourthly, the UK needs to focus on its comparative advantages. And its comparative advantages are in two particular sectors, education and financial services. That's where people say Britain is leading the world, that's how we want. And I would add a third, which is in creativity and culture, because one of the most dynamic sectors of the African economy is the creative side of it. Film, books, television, art, culture in all its forms, music, enormous. And they are making a lot of money and creating a lot of jobs in these sectors. And that is also an area where we have significant competitive advantage over others. At the moment, if you look at the bulk of UK investment into Africa, it's in the extractive sector. It's oil and gas, mining, in terms of percentage of total investment. And we need to diversify that. Education is not sort of high-value investment, but it's high benefit. And it's not just bringing Africans here, but it's building those partnerships with particularly higher education, universities, where UK is undoubtedly one of the world leaders, and building up African higher education institutions, which have suffered a lot since the 1980s, and would hugely benefit from the kind of partnerships that build them up, which some British universities are doing. And I would just mention Royal African Society is working with the African Studies Association of the UK to try and build some kind of a register, an understanding of how many British universities have existing partnerships with African universities, because there's no central organisation, and then how we can build up those. So those are the areas. There's one additional area of huge British advantage in relation to Africa, and that is the diaspora. And there are about somewhere between 1 and 2 million people in this country of African extraction, and they're a really important constituency with whom we engage quite a lot. I think the government is keen to engage more, but it provides a very direct personal family link, often strong financial links to the African community in Africa, and is an area of, if you like, competitive advantage that we have. The last area I'll mention, sorry to go on at some length, is that all this effort to build our engagement with Africa can be undermined by one issue, and that is visas. And at the moment, wherever I go in Africa, whatever African I speak to, the single most common cause of complaint against Britain is the visa regime. Not that it's too tight, but that it seems arbitrary, expensive, time-consuming, and, to be honest, a word that has been used several times, humiliating. And I remember as British High Commissioner in Ghana, I had to go to the office of the Vice President and ask him to show me his bank accounts. The visas section had insisted they needed to see his bank accounts, and they asked him to come in to present them at the visa section, and I said that was not acceptable. We had to go to him, but nevertheless they would not issue him with a 10-year visa without seeing his bank accounts. I would call that humiliating, and I don't think any British government minister would be willing to have their personal finance exposed to a foreign country in return for a visa. So I think the word is justifiably used, and unless that issue is addressed, a lot of the other effort to try and increase our engagement and our build on our advantages with Africa will be wasted.
Thank you very much for that helpful overview. And I'm now going to turn to Baroness Fall to begin teasing out some details, some of which you may have referred to, but some new topics too. Baroness Fall.
Thank you. Well, you actually didn't talk very much about the security challenge in Africa, and I mean it is very real in terms of both global stability, but also obviously for the region. And I just wondered what you felt about the UK's role and relation, but also what your assessment was, some of the difficult issues there, radical Islam terrorism especially, but also civil war, which has long been a problem. Do you consider both those two, but in general, is it getting more, is the security challenge getting greater, or do you think it's improving?
There are many layers to that question.
Yes.
So I'll just draw on some of them, but it's a very important one. I think if you look at a sort of index of conflict in Africa, the number of conflicts is going down. But the ones that remain are proving very intractable.
Yes.
And what is interesting about Africa since independence is that almost all the conflicts have not been between countries, but within countries. They've been civil conflicts. And this reflects, if you like, the fact that a lot of the territories were carved up fairly arbitrarily. And on independence, the people within any defined geographical space, the borders that had been drawn by the colonial powers, had to find a way to get on together. While they were trying to get rid of a colonial power, that was a uniting factor. Everybody wanted to be free. But once you got rid of them, you then had to find what kind of political balance, what kind of political system do we need? And that has given rise to quite a lot of internal conflict, both wars of secession like Biafra, coups, inter-ethnic conflicts of one sort or another. And that process is, in many cases, settling down. And a country like Nigeria has found a political structure that more or less works adequately for most people at the moment. Some countries have emerged into quite robust and stable democracies, like Ghana, like Senegal. I would have said like Tanzania, but it seems to be a little less so. South Africa as well. People don't go to war over the question of political succession. But in many countries, this balance is still being found. And in younger countries, like South Sudan, the conflict is very real and very actual, and as yet not resolved. They've not yet found a political way that enables all the people within that space called South Sudan to live together and share the resources in a way that people accept, so they pick up arms. So that's one of the drivers of conflict, that it's a question of, for each society, finding a way to build a political system that works for them. This is exacerbated, in some cases, by resource scarcity, and climate change is having a direct impact. And the current area of greatest instability runs from the Sahel in the west through to Somalia in the east. And it's, you see on a map, it's geographically clear. It's all red zone where conflicts are greatest, are the zones of greatest climatic stress, environmental stress due to the climate. And it's that band just sort of south of the Sahara. There are other unstable areas, the Central African Republic, but it's a common feature. And in particular, somewhere like Nigeria, internal conflicts are being seriously exacerbated by resource scarcity in the Middle Belt, where the herders are coming down from the Sahel. There's less pasturage up there. The number of arable farmers is growing, and the two are coming into conflict. And that's a very serious cause of instability, I think not yet registered. We know about Nigeria's problems in the Delta, with various groups keen to secure more of the oil wealth, the problems in the northeast, caused by Boko Haram, but in the Middle Belt there's growing instability in Nigeria, which is a real threat. So climate change is causing stress. And then there is population growth. And this is one of the sort of key factors in African history in the 20th century. In 1900, they reckon there were around 120 million people on the continent of Africa. In the 60 years up to independence, that doubled to about 240, 250. In the 60 years since independence, it has quadrupled. So now about 1.2 billion. And the projections, if you look at sort of linear projections, by 2050 it's going to be well over 2.5 billion. And that is a great success. because historically Africa has been underpopulated because the environment is harsh, diseases are rife, and it means far more people are living. But every other continent becomes a point at which the level of prosperity is such that children start becoming more of a cost than an asset, and then the population starts to turn down. That has not yet happened in Africa. And therefore, population pressure to create more food for them to eat, jobs for them to do, will continue. And that is also causing a degree of conflict risk, because unemployed young men in particular, I'm afraid, tend to get violent. And they will find a cause to do that. But that is a risk. So the high priority in order to create stability of creating more jobs, dynamising the economies, is really central. Terrorism and violent extremism you can tackle as a security issue, as an ideological issue, but there is a fundamental underlying economic issue. Busily employed, prosperous young people are less likely to become extremists. So we as the UK can certainly and should help countries tackle those issues. But in Nigeria, considerable effort has already been put into tackling or supporting the Nigerians tackle Boko Haram. But the fundamental drivers of that revolt in the northeast have not yet been tackled. And the fundamental drivers are the economic stress, the fact that it was a completely neglected area. I think we have that problem in this country as well. They were getting no benefits from the oil wealth further south. And there was therefore sort of very little loyalty to the state. And a lot of fairly desperate people who wanted to find a cause. And the other driver of it has been that the military response to the Boko Haram threat has been positively counterproductive. And I'm afraid the Nigerian army has not helped. We can continue and should continue training them, but fundamentally that's going to be a political issue. So that's sort of some of the drivers of conflict. It is very important because conflict drives the migration of people primarily next door to each other. And the migrants who want to come to Europe tend to be the more aspirational. To some extent, they are more educated. The poorest don't think of moving any further than they need to find a living. And therefore, again, for us, it's quite important, and for Europe as a whole, to stimulate the economic growth in a way that will diminish that pressure, both by diminishing conflict and diminishing the economic pressure to move. In the Horn of Africa, there is a lot of climate stress, and it's being dealt with differently by different countries. Where there is no governance, as in South Sudan, it's very violent. Where there is quite an effective government in Ethiopia, it is still causing stress, but it is being managed by the government. And we hope Prime Minister Abiy is able to keep the reforms moving fast enough to maintain control. In Somalia, it did cause stress for a long time. There is now a sort of diffused governance arrangement which has reduced the conflict, but still Al-Shabaab are there and are feeding off people's grievances and the difficulty of providing law and order in large parts of the country. So I think the UK has three roles. Firstly, to help build these transparent institutions of accountability. Secondly, to accelerate economic growth. And thirdly, to provide that security support that we have been doing with Nigeria and Kenya, but we need to up the political engagement if that is to be effective.
Thank you very much indeed. And you've already seeded some more ideas that we'll need to pursue in following questions. May I turn to Lord Alton, please?
Thank you, Lord Chairman. Nick, you've moved the debate on nicely to the next area, really, which is about democratic accountability and human rights, and where that fits with, as it were, our trade policy. And your earlier response to Baroness Emily, you were clear that one size doesn't fit all, and what may be a Westminster model therefore may not be appropriate in some places. But nevertheless, you also went on to say that there is huge respect for the United Kingdom's values and traditions, and you said that we've got to teach for habits. So can you spell that out to us a little bit more, especially in the context of the increased emphasis we're placing on trade and how we do business with Africa? You might want to look at, for instance, the modern-day slavery legislation, part of our values. How does that fit with 136,000 children being deployed in cobalt mines in the Congo, or whatever it may be? May I also, in that context, quote something that you said yourself in a post on the 9th of January, where you quoted a Sudanese protester in African Arguments, and who said that this isn't just about the price of bread or fuel, but incompetence, the corruption and the oppression which were hallmarks of the Sudanese regime. And of course its former leader Omar al-Bashir responsible for genocide and crimes against humanity. Where does that fit into the narrative of how we do business with countries like the Republic of Sudan?
Yeah, no, thank you for spotting that. I mean, it underlines to me, and this is sort of continues, the previous question overlaps the two, as you say, that I would say many African governments have maybe 5 to 10 years from now in which to ensure that there is an accountable system of government and a rapid economic growth. Otherwise, you will see an African Spring, a fairly revolutionary change, because the young people just won't wait. So the time is quite short. And human rights, democratic values and institutions are an essential area, as I said at the beginning, where the UK is currently looked to as a model. So it's quintessential, if you like, to our USP as Britain in Africa. It's that, okay, we have a colonial past, plenty of sins to regret in that period, but now people tend to look at us as a model of democracy. There have been some questions raised about that in the last year or two, but that is still the way Britain is perceived. And that sort of, it goes with people's image of the UK. If we were to lose that image and undermine it, then we might gain contracts, but we would lose influence. So I would say it remains critical to the UK's influence in Africa to be seen as a model of transparency and democracy. It's soft power, and soft power doesn't always equal influence. The UK has a huge amount of soft power. The royal family, the BBC, the English Premier League, and everybody thinks all these are wonderful, but that doesn't translate into votes at the UN. Nevertheless, if we are seen to be not true to our own ideals and values, and people start saying, you're a bit hypocritical, Britain, then we will lose more than we gain, in my view. How you encourage the development of good human rights and good governance in Africa is tricky. Everybody hates being lectured, and there's a high risk of it being counterproductive if we are seen as hectoring or lecturing. This becomes an issue in relation to sanctions. And on my travels around Africa, one of the places I visited recently was Rwanda. In Rwanda, we have very close relations with the government, and the civil society activists and political opponents that I met says, why aren't you calling out Rwanda on its human rights abuses? The strange death of so many opposition figures at home and abroad. Why are you, Britain, the champion of values, not calling out President Kagame? On the other hand, we have good relations with President Kagame. We'll be going there for Chogam in a few months' time. he has transformed his country. But it is the kind of dilemma that we have, where there is an autocrat who's doing quite a good job, is reducing poverty, spending aid money well, uncorrupt government, but there are human rights questions. Where is the right balance? And the answer is you need to have a relationship of trust and confidence with the country as a whole, not just the government, but with the people, whereby you can say some of these things. And some of them you have to say behind closed doors. And I know some conversations with Rwanda have taken place behind closed doors. But for Britain's image, we have to at least be seen to be consistent in public as well as private. So it is a dilemma, and sanctions are quite, can be double-edged, but getting that balance right and finding the right words is a bit of an art. And when I was working in the European Union, again, this was a big issue because under the EU, under the Cotonou Convention, was an Article 96, if there are human rights abuses, if there's gross corruption, we can suspend our aid. And it's written in there, accepted by both sides. I'll be interested to see whether we replicate that post-Brexit in our various aid and trade agreements, because one of the improvements that many on the African side would like to see in the post-Brexit arrangements is that we drop those conditionalities. So that will be a bit of a test for the government as to whether we do that. Now, people compare us with Russia, with China in particular, politically blind, we'll just do the deal, do the money, the rest. One thing I have found, we may come on to this more later, is that actually in China's case, their interest is in stability and economic growth. And there's a bit of common ground there. Russia is different. Russia thrives on disorder.
Thank you. And I appreciate the fact we're halfway through taking evidence. And I know that I have colleagues who are very keen that we do get to the end of them. So I'm not going to take supplementaries to this one, but I hope anybody with supplementary will be able to flesh it out in their own questions. So I'm going to turn straight away to Baroness Blackstone, if I may.
You talked quite extensively about some of the drivers to conflict in Africa. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how far you think the African Union is effective in dealing with security issues, peace problems in Africa, and secondly, with economic growth.
Yeah, thank you. The African Union, rather like the European Union, is a many splendid thing, but it's very different. It aspires to be like the EU, but is not. It is very important, and it is very influential, and it is an indispensable forum, but it is not powerful. It doesn't have the levers of power. It is not,
is that what you're saying?
Almost no levers of power. Most African countries, having only recently achieved sovereignty, are rather jealous of that sovereignty and like to preserve it. There's therefore not a lot of willingness to transfer sovereignty to a multinational body. So they're proud and independent, but they recognise most of them, in the great scheme of things in the world, are very small, and their individual voices will be drowned out. And they have learnt from the independence struggle that unity is strength, and they operate quite effectively as a lobby in the UN. The Africa group has quite a lot of cohesion on quite a few things, and that is done through the African Union. And the leaders turn up to their summits. Most leaders are there every time, so to that extent a bit like the European Council as well. You have to be there. The regional organisations remain in some ways more influential on security issues, and although they were originally economic, they have done more actually in, apart from the East African Community, which is quite a strong economic integration. They're more important on security issues. ECOWAS spends more time resolving conflicts in its region than in developing a common currency. And in some areas, the African Union is really critical, like Somalia, where it is AMISOM is an African Union mission. So on the peace and security side, both the regional organisations and the African Union are important. And they back peace processes. Thabo Mbeki has been working on Sudan for a long time. And where you can get unity of purpose amongst African nations, and the AU is the means to do that, they can be quite influential on the continent in resolving conflicts. Somalia is a good example of that. Burundi and South Sudan are bad examples because neighbouring countries have remained divided, and therefore there's not been universal pressure to resolve those conflicts. Secondly, in the economic area, the CFTA, free trade, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, is now a major factor. It's still at the level of aspiration, so it's quite easy to reach agreement. As we know, on trade deals, the devil is in the detail, and they haven't yet got down to the detail. But it's been a significant political achievement to get every country, including Nigeria, who are amongst the most reluctant, to join. The irony is that large countries are usually the main beneficiaries of free trade agreements, and yet it is the large countries, South Africa and Nigeria, that have been most reluctant to join this. Partly because both have certain areas of protected industry that are reluctant to be open to competition from neighbours who would underbid them. This happens. So the UK-AU Memorandum of Understanding is very good and is a very helpful basis, but we now need to identify specific areas where we work together with the AU in doing that. Trade must be one. All our agreements should be geared to supporting the trend towards economic integration. It's a little bit hard for us to do that coherently at the moment, given our own position with the European Union, to urge that they integrate when we are disintegrating. But nevertheless, that would be a good thing to do. And secondly, on security, it's very important to work with the AU in areas where we are trying to resolve issues. That particularly is in the Horn and the Sahel. In the Sahel, the African Union actually could play a bigger role than it has done, but it has been rather kept out by the regional organisation, not ECOWAS, but the G5 Sahel, which has become the main vehicle. And if we wish to up our game in the Sahel, we need to engage with both the G5 and the AU. The AU has the benefit, it brings in all the North African countries, Algeria, in principle Libya, as well as the West African ones, and that's essential if we're to genuinely stabilise the Sahel. So I see the AU as essential, a key partner, one we need to devote more attention to. It would be a very good thing if on his next visit to Africa, the Prime Minister stopped in Addis Ababa and saw both the Ethiopians and the AU. It would send a very important and welcome political signal.
There's a bit of a conflict between the first part of your answer to my initial question. I was going to come on to the Memorandum of Understanding, but you've picked it up anyway. In the first part of your answer, you said that the African Union, particularly in a pan-African sense, doesn't have a great deal of power. And it's the regional associations that probably get a bit more done. That I took from what you were saying. Yet you've said that the MOU that we've signed is important in spite of that. And I just wonder, whether the two parts of what you said are saying the same thing, and whether there aren't other routes for the UK to influence and support both economic development and the pursuit of peace and security than through the AU.
The AU has symbolic power, and all African leaders will pay it great respect. They won't give it, if you like, physical or economic power at the moment. It's not, the level of trust is not at that level yet. But they all pay great attention. They, as I say, they turn up to the summits. What the AU says is important to them, to the participants. and therefore we should show it respect.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to turn to Lord Hannay. And Lord Hannay, I know there's a supplementary to this question on trade that you'd like to add. So can I just give advance notice that to Dr. Westcott?
Yes. Could I ask you a three-headed question, really, because, one, I wanted to pick up on what you earlier said. I followed what you said about democracy and democratic institutions and what you said about accountability being perhaps a higher priority. But at no stage did you refer to the rule of law as being important in these countries. Would I be right in thinking that you would place the rule of law on the accountability side of the ledger rather than on the democratic institutions side of the ledger? That's the first part of the question. Secondly, could you just perhaps compare a bit the EU's current approach to Sub-Saharan Africa, characterising the extent to which it coincides with the British approach to that so far, when we've been a part of the European Union, or whether there are really very sharp differences between what we would have ideally wanted and what the EU, with ourselves in it, have actually been doing. And that, of course, carries, I suppose, the implication of how close our relationship should be post-Brexit with the European Union and its policies on Africa. And the third one is a strictly trade-related issue. Really, there are two questions it would help you if you could answer. One is, what could the UK, negotiating on its own after the end of the transitional period, offer Africa, which is not being offered to Africa currently by the EU and therefore by the UK as part of the EU? What sectors would that involve? Is there a big amount of space there for a particular British input? And secondly, which is probably a bit more sensitive, what should the UK in the next period of time be asking from African countries in terms of our access to their markets, and the question, of course, as always being, should we insist on some degree of reciprocity, or should we be thinking in the trade area of a simple unilateral free trade approach from our side without worrying too much about the access the Africans give us?
Thank you. Spot-on questions. The rule of law, you're quite right. I would consider part of building proper accountability. And therefore it comes under overall encouragement of good governance. It is actually, I should have mentioned it, it's one of the areas of British competitive advantage, particularly in Commonwealth countries, but even outside. And I'm visiting Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, they said, we really like your legal system. It seems to be much better at generating economic growth. But we're stuck with this French system. Again, it's an area where people look to the UK as a model of effective rule of law, and it should be an integral part of our sort of offer, if you like, and our identity. We can help build it. And the Commonwealth networks, I haven't mentioned the Commonwealth much, but these networks, particularly amongst lawyers, chief justices in the Commonwealth, are really valuable, because they provide a kind of peer group support for a lot of, African judiciaries have been under pressure, and several of them, yesterday in Malawi, last year in Kenya, are showing their independence, and this is a good thing, and we should be there supporting it. So a very important area to include. In terms of the EU, historically, the UK has been central to the EU's approach to Africa. Before 1974, EU policy on Africa was basically French. Former colonies, support them. After the UK joined, it became very much a joint effort. And therefore has been a very close alignment between British interests and policies on Africa and European ones. European aid programs, for example, have been enormously influenced by DFID. and have therefore become much better value for money. So there has been very close alignment, if you like, high alignment at the moment between EU and UK interests in Africa. In terms of effectiveness of sanctions and of aid conditionality, the UK again has been absolutely central, and therefore EU policy has been effective, I would say. And places like Malawi and Uganda, the EU suspension of aid was fundamental to reinforcing the fight against corruption in both those countries, and was very effective. And the UK was an integral part of that, both for pushing for the sanctions and the sanctions then being effective. And it would significantly weaken the pressure were we to diverge from that post-Brexit. Secondly, the EU was quite central to delivering some of the UK's national objectives. And the classic case of this is Somalia, where that has been a priority for the UK. It was never a priority for France. They were always trying to drag resources away from the Horn towards the Sahel. And the EU paid for AMISOM, which was critical to our objective to help stabilise Somalia and introduce peaceful, accountable government. The EU had financial firepower that was really central and acted as a multiplier for many UK priorities. So Brexit has a major impact on that. Our interests remain fundamentally aligned. We want a peaceful, prosperous Africa, as does the rest of the EU. Their concerns about migration are even greater than ours, and they understand the solution is the same. On the Sahel, there's a great welcome that the UK has increased its focus on the Sahel, because it's a priority for the whole of Southern Europe, as well as for France, and a positive contribution there will earn a great deal of credit, as well as helping make it effective. Fundamentally, I think our interests therefore will remain aligned, and it makes sense to continue to coordinate very closely. On the trade issue, if you like, that's where we're competitors. And there is potential for significant new deals. As I mentioned before, Africans see Brexit as a great opportunity to get a better deal from the UK than they have had from the EU. Where is that better? It's in more money. Free access is fairly guaranteed under everything but arms anyway, and we will continue to respect that. So the important thing is for the middle income countries, those emerging prosperous ones, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, those that are having developing economies. And that's, if you like, where the EPAs have been most contentious, and we need to listen to the African objections to the EPAs and respond to those concerns, which is unfortunately not necessarily what's in the national economic interest. Where would we look for improvements? We would like better access for services, educational services, financial services. That's where our competitive advantage lies. It's where Africans are actually asking for our expertise, but where there is a great deal of protectionist pressure in African countries. Probably less so on education, but on financial services, very strong. Therefore, ideally, we should ask for greater access in financial services. On the other hand, for many African countries, that's been part of the objection of the EU approach. It has wanted to open up service sectors. Legal services is the other one where. Now, in fact, the UK is doing quite well. We should look at least to preserve the existing access that we've got. And many of the large London law firms work in very close collaboration with local African legal partners, and it's quite a good system that works. Similarly with banks. So there will be some tensions in negotiating these trade deals. And as I mentioned, the other area they would like to reduce conditionality is on the human rights and governance side. So under the EU, we could do all this under cover of the collective negotiation. Now we're exposed, and we will have to make these trade-offs. Are we going to get more on services? Are we going to give ground on conditionality? I shouldn't be too cynical. A lot of African countries are quite happy with degree of transparency and a degree of mutual reciprocity. But there are all political pressures in all countries to try and restrain that.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm now going to turn to Baroness Rawlings.
Dr. Westcott, thank you very much for those very interesting papers and fascinating introduction. I wondered which non-African countries you see should be the UK's most important partners in Sub-Saharan Africa. And if we did partner countries, how would that affect and solve could that affect or solve the visa problem through that? And then you mentioned China. Would that be a beneficial, as they are so huge at the moment in Africa? And I wondered whether suddenly something's happened now with a cancellation of flights or not, and it would be coming to a bit of a halt.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's an important one because, if you like, there is a struggle for influence in Africa by others. Just as there is now an African scramble for Europe, there is an international scramble for influence in Africa. Our interests are very broadly aligned still with the EU member states, as I mentioned, but also with the US, and significantly with China, as I suggested before. There are common interests. Our interests are less closely aligned with Russia and with the Gulf countries that are playing an increasing role. India is a commercial player, but less influential politically, but growing. And Turkey is also a growing player on Africa outside. I count Morocco here, which is also expanding its influence south as an African country, in the same way that South Africa has huge commercial interests in the rest of Africa. But so those are African partners. So the non-African ones, those are, if you like, the key players now. France is our, as bilaterally, it's our best friend and oldest rival in Africa. And it was very interesting travelling to Francophone countries. There's a number of people who said, please, Britain, where are you? We want you to come. We're fed up with these French. And there have been riots, protests against French influence. And there's been this move against the CFA franc, the French-run regional currency, which in West Africa has now been rebranded as a local currency, the ECO. And therefore, with France, we have a lot of common interest. We work together in the Sahel. It's very important to remain closely in touch with them on African policy because they have hard power where we tend to have economic and soft power. The two together can be profoundly influential, but there are divergences of geographical interest. With Germany, our common area of cooperation is really in the development area, the development sector, and there we need to work very closely with them. They are nearly as big a donor to Africa as we are, also a big investor. Chancellor Merkel has made this a high priority for her through the G20 initiative, and broadly we're very closely aligned with them. The US, there are two particular areas. Traditionally, we've worked very closely together on democracy and conditionality. That appears to be a lower priority on the US side at the moment. And the struggle against terrorism, which remains a high priority, and where the US have a much bigger physical investment than we do in both the Horn from Djibouti and in the Sahel, where they have quite a big base. I'm sorry. The US have big security presence both in the Horn and in the Sahel, and are important. And it's important we remain closely aligned with them on security, counter-terrorism, and encourage them to remain engaged on the democracy and human rights. China shares our interest in promoting rapid growth in Africa. They do it in slightly different ways. but they therefore also have a high interest in stability in Africa, because instability, conflict reduces growth. And they want Africa as both a source of raw materials and a market for their goods. To some extent, exactly the same as us. And when I was working on Sudan, South Sudan, I found the Chinese very closely aligned to us and very helpful in trying to work towards resolving the conflicts, both between Sudan and South Sudan and within South Sudan. So we should be working with China on this. Yes, the coronavirus will have an impact temporarily, and it is, I think, 10 years ago, when I would visit China to talk about Africa, they were eager to listen to us. Now, they are not. They are much bigger, they're much more influential. Every African leader will go to the summits with President Xi, and they don't feel they need to listen to us anymore. And that's in 10 years, that change in perception has happened.
Ask about the visa problem that
Yes.
you mentioned. Do they all have visa problems like us?
No,
So it's only us,
it's
more or less.
primarily us. In that there is plenty of evidence that both getting a US visa and a Schengen visa, certainly a Chinese visa, is much easier. And the rumours are that the Gulf, they'll not only give you a visa, they'll give you a whole passport for a sufficient price. So yes, it's a very competitive market out there. And many people have told me, I've given up coming to London, it's just too tough, just too hard, I'm going to go somewhere else instead, to do business, to get educated. And this is what I found talking to people. They said, if I want to do business, I'll go to China. No problem, get a visa, fly there straight away, as long as there are flights. And there's quite a growing African community in south of China. If I want education, I'll go to Canada or the US. It's in English language. It's a bit more expensive in the US, but there are more scholarships, and I have no problem getting a 2-year visa. And if I want to have fun, I go to Dubai. So there's still a wish to come to London, but people are increasingly giving up bothering.
Yes.
So yes, it is a competitive market.
Thank you very much. And for our concluding question, I'm going to turn to Lady Smith, whose thunder has been a little bit stolen by Baroness Rawlings, but on the particular issue of China. Baroness Smith.
Thank you. Well, in lots of ways, I think all the... you've possibly talked about all the potential allies and areas where there are roles where we conflict or work together. You've talked about Russia being disruptive. How influential is it, though, in Sub-Saharan Africa?
Very interesting. Until a couple of years ago, I would have said they're insignificant. But in the last 2 years, they have made a concerted effort to raise their profile. And at the Africa summit that President Putin hosted in Sochi, he had about 40 African leaders, remembering that we had 15 here in London 2 weeks ago. But he invited them all, and not only that, he paid for not only the presence, but their whole delegations. And this obviously encourages people to come. So, however, Russia deploys very small resources, very strategically, and very effectively. Their competitive advantage is the Wagner Group, which is basically a bunch of Russian mercenaries for hire to support governments that wish to enforce security. And they have followed that up also with some arms deals. So in the Central African Republic, now in Mozambique, even in Mali, and obviously in Libya, where they are supporting General Haftar, they select areas, they go in to support governments of their preference, and therefore, rather like in the Middle East, people think, I'd better talk to the Russians. why not? And also, Russia is quite assiduous at the UN. David may remember this, at cultivating the African community. It was quite noticeable in any General Assembly vote against the US. Most Africans would recently abstain rather than vote against Russia. And the Ukraine resolution was a quite interesting example. A lot of African countries did not vote against Russia. Russia is extraordinarily focused. The same goes for the Gulf, which again I haven't mentioned much of. They are very focused on two things. One, commercial advantage for themselves, and this is the UAE's establishment all around the Gulf of Aden, taking control of ports, and ideological Islam, where unfortunately this is a competitive issue between Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE, who are paying different sides in Somalia, which is not helping produce a result, and obviously in Libya, with Turkey and Qatar supporting one side and the UAE and Egypt supporting the other. So that's not conducive to stability, but they are pursuing their national interests. It would be quite important for the UK, which has an important and close relationship with the Gulf states, to raise Africa in it. To say, we both have an interest in stability, don't we? Let's make sure our actions promote stability and not instability. But on Russia, I don't think there's much scope for a productive dialogue with Russia, but it's important to highlight to some African countries that they may not be a productive friend.
Thank you very much indeed, and you have brought us absolutely to the point of our end of our hour's session. Thank you very much indeed for your contributions today and responding to our questions. We appreciate it's such a vast subject that we were going to range widely, but you supplied us with the acute observations that we needed. Thank you very